Hey there, and welcome back to the podcast. By mid June, your garden is in full swing, but this also means it's about the time where pests start showing up. Some are subtle and probably won't cause too many issues, but many can be especially destructive. Today, we're going to cover 5 common pests that often show up in the summer that many gardeners have to deal with. We're going to talk about what signs to look for and then what you can do to prevent and manage them organically. Now, as you know, there are way more than 5 pests in the garden, but these are the ones that I feel like most gardeners deal with, and they also are a little bit different from one another. For example, we're going to talk about the tomato hornworm, but many of the methods that you can use against the hornworm can also be used against the armyworm. So we're going to talk about different types of pests. So hopefully, even if you're dealing with one that is different than what we're talking about today, some of the same measures can be used with similar pests that might be in your garden. I hope you're not having a major problem with pests so far, but if you are, I hope this episode comes as a timely reminder for you of what you can do to keep your garden productive even when the pests arrive. Before we dive in, I want to invite you to my summer gardening workshop happening on June 17th at 7 p.m. Central Time. If you want to keep your garden thriving through the heat, if you want to prevent pests and disease or deal with them organically before they become a major issue in your garden, and also if you want to know exactly what to do when things go wrong, this workshop is for you. We're going to talk about all the things that you need to know to try to prevent problems before they start and then manage them once they show up. And with your ticket to the live workshop, which will include access to the replay if you've got a busy summer and you can't make it that day, you will also get access to a bonus preserving workshop, which will be helpful if you're looking to preserve any of that harvest that you're hoping to protect. You can get all of this for only $19 with the code SUMMER25. Whether you come live and you're able to participate in the live Q&A at the end, or you're able to watch the replay at your convenience, I hope you sign up for this workshop and it's helpful for you in your garden. Again, June 17th at 7 p.m. I hope to see you there. You can go to journeywithjill.net/summer workshop to grab your ticket. And as always, that link will also be in the show notes for your convenience. Let's talk about the first pest that tends to show up in my garden every year. And often it shows up mostly in my greenhouse early on. And I think that's because the temperatures in the greenhouse in the late winter start to warm up, creating a haven for this pest, and that is aphids. Aphids are very common in the garden, and they are often the ones that show up the earliest in our gardens with or without a greenhouse. They will appear in early spring and summer, especially as temperatures start to rise steadily, especially when it gets into the 60s and 70s, and they really start to proliferate in our gardens in the spring outside when temperatures are steadily in the 70s and even 80s. They love that temperature. They thrive from coast to coast, so most of us are probably going to have to deal with aphids at one point or another, but they do have faster outbreaks in warm, humid, and even southern climates. And here's the thing that makes aphids so difficult to manage is that they reproduce asexually and they reproduce fast. You can see a few aphids one day and see your whole plant covered with them within a few days because their population expands very fast. If you're not familiar with aphids, here's what you want to look for. You'll be able to identify them because they will often appear in clusters with each other, and they are small, pear-shaped, soft-bodied insects, and typically they are going to congregate around new growth. They really like those new growing leaves. If you're growing peppers or tomatoes, they're probably going to be at the tips. They don't really care as much about the older leaves as they do those new ones. And they love the flowers. Aphids love pepper flowers, especially when I'm growing peppers in the greenhouse and maybe I'm not able to get them out in time and they start flowering. The aphids flock to those flowers. Other ways that you can identify if you have aphids is you'll see curling leaves. And sometimes they have a tendency to be a little stippled, like they are bumpy, because that indicates that the aphids are sucking the juices out of the plant. So the leaf, instead of being smooth, it's kind of irregular and bumpy as far as its texture. You also may notice some sticky residue that they leave behind. This is to attract ants because ants serve as protectors of the aphids. That's what you'll see when you read about aphids farming ants or ants farming aphids. I think it's aphids farming ants. They're trying to attract the ants so that the ants can protect them from predators. So often you'll see the presence of ants first because they're a little bit easier to be able to identify. And if you look closer, often you will see aphids. Knowing that aphids are so common in our gardens, what do we do about them? Well, I feel like aphids are some of the easiest pests to be able to manage organically. And we can do this in several different ways, just depending on how bad the problem might be in your garden. The first thing I want you to do is to adopt a big picture mindset and to resist the urge to panic spray and think, oh, I have aphids, I need to do something about them. But instead, let's go a step beyond. Now, this is something I'm going to go into in much more detail in the summer workshop. We're going to talk about different levels of pest control. Often our first level is what organic spray can I use? But I'm going to encourage you to go above that and start thinking about your garden holistically. You see, aphids are often called the salad bowl of the insect world because so many good bugs love to eat aphids. So they have lots of natural predators. What you'll want to do in your garden design, especially as you're deciding what flowers to choose or even letting some of your herbs or greens bolt, is you want to encourage beneficial insects that will prey on these aphids. The most commonly known ones are going to be your ladybugs, lacewings, syrphid flies, and parasitic wasps. Now, ladybugs are obvious. You see them crawling around, and I'm always get really excited when I see ladybugs because I know that they are looking for a food source for their babies. It's the baby larvae. They look like little alligators. You may mistake them for a pest insect, but they're not. They are on the prowl wanting to eat the aphids. So make sure if you're a new gardener that you know what a ladybug larva looks like, because you want to make sure and let them do their job. They're doing a good thing. Also, lacewings, they're a little bit harder to identify in the garden because they've got these wings they're almost fairy-like. They're light green and they're see-through. I've only seen a few in my garden because they're so easy to camouflage, but their larvae also love to eat aphids. And then syrphid flies I see all the time. You may mistake them for a sweat bee, depending on the size of them. They can be really little, but they can be a little bit larger. But the way that you can identify syrphid flies is they do have some yellow markings, kind of like a bee does, but they hover. They're also known as hover flies. But you can see them hovering around. They're not just going from point to point. It was actually kind of funny when I was at a friend's garden when I was in New York. She actually had her garden covered with insect netting, but there was an insect that was flying inside, and she asked me what it was, and I could tell right away that it was a syrphid fly because of the way it was hovering. And I'm like, keep that there. You want that there. If any bad pests get inside your insect netting, it's going to take care of it, hopefully. So the whole point is we want to encourage beneficial insects because these are going to help, and if not completely take care of aphids. I have watched this happen in my garden. I've talked about this before, so this isn't something new, but if you're a new listener to the podcast, I rarely will do anything when I see aphids in my garden because I know that I have these beneficial insects. I plant crops to attract them, and I know eventually they will take care of it, and I've watched it. I have watched syrphid fly larvae eat aphids in front of my very eyes. You have to be watching for it, but it's an amazing sight. So I actually want a little bit of aphid presence in my garden because I want to feed these beneficial insects. And the thing is, these beneficial insects don't only eat aphids, they also take care of other pests. So I want them in my garden. And so if their first food source is going to be aphids, then I want to be okay with a little bit of aphid pressure. Now, not to say that they can't cause damage or don't cause a lot, because they can. They definitely can eventually get out of control. I've seen it more in other people's gardens than my own, but occasionally I have seen them just really descend on a tomato plant, and I'm wondering, okay, should I step in? And sometimes I will knock them off with a blast of water. That's usually the easiest thing to do. That way you don't risk hurting any of the beneficial insects that might be present. But that's usually the first line of defense is just take a blast of water from your water hose. Watering can is probably not going to be strong enough, but your water hose blasts them off, and then that will definitely help. Another thing you can do proactively is to avoid over fertilizing with nitrogen, because this promotes soft, juicy growth, that new growth that aphids love. So try not to over fertilize. If you have a really bad problem with aphids, and I don't, so I've never done this before, but this is something that you can do, is if you know you have a problem with aphids, you could consider covering your soil with a silver plastic mulch. And what this will do is it'll make it more difficult for them to find their host plants. The book that I referenced a lot with this podcast episode was Susan Mulvihill's book, The Vegetable Garden Pest Handbook. I've had Susan on the podcast before. We'll link that conversation in the show notes. But she actually has resources for the silver plastic mulch if you're interested in that, if you're having trouble with aphids, because it makes it difficult for the aphids to find their host plants. Another thing you can do is use floating row cover if needed before they arrive or right after you plant your crops. Now, what can you do once they become a problem? Again, like I said, spray with water, especially if it's early. Personally, I recommend wait for the beneficials to show up. Now, a lot of people will say, I want to go buy some ladybugs or I want to go buy some lacewings. And I know people have done that and have had success with it. But from most of what I've heard from other people and experts that have recommended this or that, they don't recommend doing this for two reasons. Number one, if you buy in ladybugs, they're most likely non-natives, and they're definitely non-native to your location because you don't get them locally. And this could adversely impact the native population that's already there. And then if you release them and they're not able to find enough of a food source, they're going to leave anyway, so you've just wasted your money. There's also concerns about how these ladybugs are harvested. That's beyond the scope of this podcast, but those are the reasons that I don't buy these good insects for my garden, partly because I don't need to, because I know that they're there, but also because I just don't know that it's going to help the native population in the long run. Another thing that you can do is buy worm castings and sprinkle the worm castings in the soil and water it in. The plants will take up a chemical called chitinase. And chitinase, when aphids ingest it, causes a problem with their digestive system, I think. I don't think it's the reproductive system, but it might be. One of the two. But anyway, that can pose a problem for the aphids. I have seen this work in some of my transplants, so this might be a good organic way to manage them that way. And then a last resort would be insecticidal soap, neem oil, or even horticultural oil. I would recommend this only as a last resort, only for really bad infestations, because I have had insecticidal soap burn my leaves, and I've had people, especially homemade versions, I've had people tell me that has happened. But they also will kill the baby insects that you want, the ladybug larva, the syrphid fly larva. Because those larvae are still soft-bodied, that chemical, even if it's insecticidal soap, it could kill the insects that you want in your garden. So that's the reason why I don't use them. The only time that I may use it is if it's in my greenhouse and it's early in the season and I know that my beneficials haven't arrived yet. That's the only time I would consider it. Otherwise, that's for me a last resort. And so I don't personally do that. But just wanted to let you know that if you have a major infestation, then that would be an option. Okay, let's move on to squash bugs. Squash bugs are super common and really frustrating. They start to appear about 4 to 6 weeks after your last frost. That's on average. Sometimes it's earlier, but they usually show up after the plants start getting established. They have a heavy presence in much of the U.S. and in particular in southern and central states. I think I've talked to my friends in the Pacific Northwest. I don't think you guys have to deal with squash bugs yet, and I hope you never have to because they're a big pain. But those of us in southern and central U.S. are definitely having to deal with this. And most of us know that we are. But if you are a very beginning gardener, squash bug eggs are copper colored, and they're usually on the undersides of the leaves of their host plants, which are going to be squash, pumpkins, cucumbers, sometimes melons. Usually if you have squash, that's pretty much what they congregate to, squash and pumpkins. but they're going to be in clusters. So they're going to be really easy to be able to identify because they're this cluster of eggs underneath the leaves. Now, ideally, we want to get those off before they have a chance to hatch, because what will happen once they start hatching and they start going through their nymph stage and all the way to adults, they're sucking the juices out of the plants. So what you'll see is wilting vines, crispy, dry leaves, and eventually too much of an assault from these squash bugs, and you're not gonna get a good harvest, and eventually the plant could die. Now, adults themselves are going to hide in mulch or even plant crevices, but often you'll see them on the leaves themselves mating. So if you can handpick any of the adults while you see them out, that's really ideal, because the more you can get, the less they're going to be able to reproduce. But the main thing is you really want to keep them from causing a major infestation. So how we do this, like I said, try to remove the eggs as quickly as you can. Try daily inspecting the leaves, especially the underside of the leaves. One other thing that you can do is to put floating row covers on your crops until flowering begins. They don't need to have access to pollinators until those flowers start to show up. And another thing you can do, and I know that I preach how important mulch is, but mulch in this case can actually allow those adults to find places to hide. So if you have a major problem with squash bugs, you may choose to forego the mulch, at least like wood chip mulch or places that they can hide in your squash bed. I've never chosen to do that necessarily because I feel like the value of mulch is so high for me, but it may be one of those things where you choose for that bed to put a like landscape fabric on top or a plastic mulch or something like that to help prevent them having a place to hide. You also can handpick the squash bugs. As I mentioned, drop them into soapy water. This is a question that I had myself that like everybody said, drop the beetles or whatever you have in soapy water. And I'm like, well, why does it have to be soapy? Well, the reason is the soap makes it where they actually will drop into the water and die. Otherwise, they'll just sit on the surface. There's a fancy word for that, but it's escaping me at the moment. But you just want to have a little bit of soap in the water so that the bugs will actually drop in it. Neem oil is often touted as something that you can use against these, but it only works on the nymphs, the soft-bodied baby adolescent squash bugs. It's not going to be effective for the adults. I've even tried spraying the eggs with spinosad, which is another organic control. Spinosad is about the highest level that I'll use. And again, in the summer workshop, we're going to talk about all of this, but I didn't find that even worked. Because here's the thing with squash bugs, they are just really hard to get rid of with any kind of chemicals. And so if I try something and I don't get a good success, like why would I put the chemicals in my garden in the first place? That's just kind of my thoughts on that. But the thing is about squash bugs is they go what's called instars, from eggs to nymphs to adult. This process lasts about 4 to 6 weeks before then they start the cycle all over again. So if you want to, spray with neem oil, you've got some time, but you have to hit them with it. You're not going to be able to spray the plant and them die that way, like with the case of BT, which we'll talk about later. But with neem oil, it has to be on contact. So basically, you're also relying on you to see all of them. And I mean, they hide. So I don't know that would ever be 100% possible. Another thing that you can do is put a board underneath your plant at night, and they'll congregate at night underneath the board. And then in the morning, you can lift it up, and then they've all gotten there, and then you could dispose of them that way. So that's an option that I've heard of that seems like it would be one that would work to try to cut down on populations as much as you can. Now, as a last resort, you might consider a pyrethrin-based organic spray for heavy infestations, but only do this in the evening to protect the pollinators. I've never done this. Pyrethrin is organic, but it's pretty stout and can do some damage to bugs that you want in your garden. My personal preference with squash bugs, and this is something that I know that people really don't want to hear because it doesn't involve anything major. My personal preference is just to take a break from squash altogether in the middle of the season. If I plant my squash early in the season and then, Usually it's the squash vine borer that kills it at the end of June, but whether it's that or squash bugs, then I take them out at the end of June, early July, and then I don't plant again till August. Having that break has made a big difference in the populations of the squash bugs in my garden. The years that I've grown trombonzino squash or pumpkins, which go all season, I've had the worst problem with squash bugs. And that's because they've had a food source all year long. But by taking a break, I take away that food source, and it's definitely helped with the populations. Are there squash bugs when I plant again in August? Yes, but they're not nearly as bad, or they haven't been in my experience, as when I didn't give my garden a break from squash plants. So that's my personal preference. It's also a very easy, lazy way to do it because I'm not spraying. I'm not doing a ton of hand picking. I mean, I am when I can, but I'm honestly just saying, okay, you win and you're going to win. Let's see if I can get a harvest before you win. And then I'm taking the plant out and then I'll try again. So it's really kind of an easy, lazy way to do it and still be able to get at least 2 harvests of squash, one early and one late. Just taking a quick break here to thank our sponsor. By the time June rolls around, most of us have our gardens planted, but that doesn't mean it's too late to keep building healthy soil and stronger plants. That's why I keep reaching for organic Rev all season long. In June, I use Rev in a few different ways. I water it into my raised beds around established plants to boost microbial life and to help the roots absorb nutrients more efficiently. I also use it when I'm succession planting. Anytime I tuck in a new seedling, I dip the root ball in a Rev and water mixture before planting. It really helps get those late season crops off to a great start. Rev helps improve moisture retention too, which is a huge deal as the summer heat ramps up. Healthier soil means healthier plants, better resilience to stress, and ultimately a bigger harvest. If you want to give your garden a boost this summer, head to organicrev.com and use my code JILL10 to get 10% off of your order. Your plants will thank you all season long. Again, organicrev.com and use my promo code JILL10. And as always, all of these links are going to be in the show notes below for your convenience. All right, let's get back to talking about pests. Next, let's talk about hornworms. I'm going to refer to these as tomato hornworms, although you may hear them as tobacco hornworms. Those are actually 2 different worms from 2 different moths, but essentially what they do to your tomato plants and pepper plants is the same. So I'm just going to call them tomato hornworms, but if you're interested in knowing the difference, you can find that online. These are the most pesky little worms, but honestly, they're not super difficult to deal with if you have a good eye and you are looking out for them. So these worms are going to appear about 5 to 8 weeks after your last frost. Often we see them in June and July. I know in my garden it's typically July, mainly when my tomato plants are starting to develop and get ready to harvest. Now these are found nationwide, but they are especially common in climates with warm, long tomato seasons. But here's the thing about these worms. They are the masters of camouflage. So a lot of times we don't see the worm first. Most of the time we're going to see the results of the worm's damage first. What you'll notice is that you have a tomato stem that all of a sudden is stripped of its leaves. Maybe all you see is a stem and nothing else, and this can happen overnight. If you look around that stem, most likely you're going to see these black droppings. And basically, yes, it is tomato worm poop, because if they're eating that much, then it's going to have to go somewhere, right? So that's what we usually see somewhere around it. That a lot of times they have kind of this little corn cob type shape. But again, the main thing is the stripped leaves. If you see those leaves stripped, you need to get your eye out, like one of those highlights magazines where you had to go find things in the big picture. Yeah, that's pretty much what you're doing here, trying to find the presence of this worm. Sometimes it can be really difficult, and sometimes you have to look at it from different angles, but sometimes no matter how hard you try, you still can't find it. One workaround that can be really fun is to go outside at night with a flashlight that's equipped with a black light. This is something that I did a few years ago, and those things light up like Christmas. And it's pretty amazing. You've got And you not only will you see hornworms, you'll see other insects too. It's kind of like weird going out in your garden at night, especially if it's pitch black and all you have is a black light. It's like a whole other world out there. But the hornworms will glow like this neon green, and then you'll be able to handpick them. So whether you do this at night under the black light or whether you're able to spot them during the day, what you want to do is handpick them, get them off the plant. And I know it's gross. You may want to put a glove on if you're squeamish. Even now, like bugs don't typically bother me, but they're just, I know, they're just icky to be able to pick them off, but they need to get off the plant as soon as possible. The only exception is if you see little white cocoons coming off of them, you don't want to touch those because that means that that worm has been parasitized by a good parasitic wasp, and those are starting to feed on the tomato hornworm. I know it sounds really gross, but basically once that hornworm is parasitized, it's not going to eat any more of your plant, and you just need to leave it there so that the good insects have a food source. Sadly, as much as I have tried to attract all the great insects, I've never found one of those in my garden, and it makes me sad because I've always wanted to. Mine have never been parasitized. But that's something that you don't want to pick it off if that's the case. Just leave it. It's not going to do any damage. So you do want to get it off. But what can you do maybe to prevent such a tomato hornworm outbreak? I mean, one hornworm can do a lot of damage, but more than one can do a lot of damage. One thing you can do is keep the area weeded. Weeds can be a host area for hornworms. Another thing you can do is try to plant crops that will attract the wasps that parasitize these. They are called braconid wasps, and they are what we want in our gardens. You can look up different crops to attract them. I grow most of the ones that attract them. Like I said, I still haven't found them, but a lot of people do. Like I see a lot of pictures every year of this happening, so it's definitely possible. Another option that people talk about is to interplant your tomatoes with basil or marigolds. This can be a minor deterrent. I have planted basil all the time. I plant with tomatoes. I don't think I plant tomatoes without basil, and I still get hornworms. I haven't done marigolds as consistently, but I am this year. But I'll tell you that when I went to visit Tammy Jansen's yard, we did a YouTube video with her. She's the one with the self-watering raised beds. She was just talking about how when she plants petunias near her tomatoes, that she didn't have any trouble with hornworms. And so I tried it last year, and I didn't have problems with hornworms either last year when the petunias were in flower. When they started fading is actually when I started to see one or two. So I'm not sure if that was just a coincidence or anecdotal. She says that it works. She's been gardening for a lot longer than me, but it might be worth trying. Petunias are beautiful, so why not? So if you're planting marigolds near your tomatoes, why not add a petunia or two and see if that helps? It can't hurt, right? But you could do this to hopefully deter that moth from laying its eggs in the first place. Another thing you can do in the fall is to clear out the debris where the hornworms would be pupating and overwintering, because that's where they're going to spend the winter. Tillage is one way to do it. Many of us with raised beds, we're not going to be tilling our beds, and many of us with ground beds don't want to till anyway, but cleaning up some of the mulch around if you have a hornworm problem can help maybe to expose those and kill them so they won't be able to come back out next year. But as I mentioned, if you already see them this year, handpick them from the plant. Another thing you can do is use Bacillus thuringiensis. What you'll do with this is you'll actually spray the BT on the plant. So the BT is not a contact killer. If you spray it on the worm, it's probably not going to do anything, although I haven't tested it. Spray it on the plant. Once the worm eats the plant leaves, then it ingests this bacteria, which is a naturally occurring bacteria, and then it stops feeding and it eventually dies. BT is good on any worms that do this, like hornworms, armyworms, cabbage worms. BT is definitely one of the most effective organic controls that I use. Supposedly, it's fairly ineffective on older caterpillars, but it's still something that you can do if you've got this infestation and you're not really sure that you're getting them all and you're losing your leaves really fast. Or like me one year, I was getting ready to go on vacation when I saw my first hornworm and I knew I wouldn't be present to handpick. I sprayed my whole tomato crop with BT to hopefully prevent them from eating all of my tomato leaves while I was gone. So you can do this proactively if you want to. But if you're present and you only have one or two, I encourage you just to handpick rather than spray. I always encourage not spraying unless you have to, even if it's organic. And we'll talk about that more in the workshop about why that's something to keep in mind. As a last resort, you can consider spinosad. It is organic, but it can still be hard on pollinators, so definitely apply that carefully. But ultimately, like I said, I recommend to handpick as much as you can, and then eventually their season will end and you won't have to deal with them anymore. This is something you might want to keep track of. When does the first hornworm show up in my garden? When do I not see them anymore? And sometimes that helps as far as planning your garden or even knowing when they're coming. One thing that I have found, and this was by accident one year, is I found that it actually worked to my advantage to have some hornworm activity, especially on tomato plants that I hadn't been super diligent with pruning, because the tomato hornworms did the pruning for me. Sometimes I prune the suckers on the tomato plants. Usually it depends on how I'm staking them and if I need to keep them compact or if I want to let them sprawl. But the times where I haven't pruned at all and I've just let them sprawl, the hornworms were able to prune for me. And yes, I'm going to get them off, but it wasn't as damaging as if I would have heavily pruned and I only had a few stems to begin with. So just throwing that out there, if you know you have hornworm problems, you might make the choice to not prune as heavily, knowing that you're going to have some damage, and then it'll be okay. All right, number 4, let's talk about another problematic bug in the middle of the summer, especially, and that is stink bugs. Stink bugs look similar to squash bugs, but the way that you can distinguish them is, number one, they're not going to be on the squash plants as much. They're going to show up on different plants. They also have, especially the brown marmorated stink bug, are going to have more of a shield on their back. They're a little smaller than the squash bugs, but they do a lot of damage, but they do different damage. But first, let's talk about what they look like or when they appear. They appear usually in the late spring to early summer, but their damage is most prevalent about 6 to 8 weeks after your last frost. They're found throughout the U.S., but again, they're more damaging in the southern and the mid-Atlantic regions. So are you noticing a theme here, those of you guys who live in the South? Yeah, we have a lot of bugs to have to contend with. So it's not just you, but these are found pretty much everywhere. As I mentioned, they have a shield shape on their back. But as far as how you can determine if you have a stink bug problem, I mean, beside actually seeing them, and then if you want to hand pick them, they smell really bad. They have this distinctive odor that they give off. You can also notice their presence by the fruit that you have in your garden. You may notice a cloudy or a dimpled spot on your tomatoes or on your peppers. You also may see these beans, corn. You also may see okra in particular. If you have an okra pod that's starting to curl, a lot of times it's been stung by a stink bug, and that's what causes the growth to be a little bit different and malformed. You can still eat it, but a lot of times that wound will scar over and be tough, so you'd want to cut around that when you eat it. But stink bugs can be on, like I said, tomatoes and peppers. The tomatoes are where they tend to congregate in my garden. Peppers, beans though, corn, even peas, okra I mentioned, and they can be on squash. But squash bugs are more common, at least in what I've seen on squash, than stink bugs are. They may hide under the leaves. They may hide in garden debris, just like many beetles do. And they're hard to prevent. They're hard to control. One thing that you can do is remove nearby weedy areas because that's where they overwinter. You can plant trap crops like sunflowers, maybe a few feet away from your garden crop, because those will attract them. You can also consider floating row covers. If you have a crop that you know is susceptible to stink bugs, then planting a floating row cover, at least until pollination is needed. Another option is to use a kaolin clay spray, and it's Kaolin. I have seen people do this with great success. I have never done this before, partly because I haven't been able to find a good source where it wasn't expensive, but people do use it, and maybe they found a source that I haven't. But these kaolin clay sprays is what you will spray on the plant, and it deters feeding. And so you'll want to do this before fruiting because you really don't want them on the fruits, but this is pretty effective to prevent them. But once they are in your garden and you see them, hand picking is always going to be like the easiest thing to do. Not that it's fun, but hand picking. And then if you have a large infestation, you might take a handheld vacuum and vacuum them up. It can definitely work in small gardens. If you see the stink bug nymphs, neem oil may work on nymphs, but they're not going to work on adults very effectively. But understand that neem oil with stink bug nymphs, it works on contact. So you have to actually spray the nymphs. You can't just spray the plant and expect it to work. You're going to have to find them. And so again, that's a matter of you. Are you going to be able to find them all? As a last resort, you could consider an insecticidal soap that is specifically created for stink bugs. You could consider a pyrethrin spray. And again, you have to make direct contact with the stink bugs. Just spraying the plant is not going to make a difference. Honestly, I haven't tried any of that. I just deal with it. I handpick when I can, but for the most part, I just try to deal with it without having to spray anything. All right, let's wrap up with number 5, and this is cucumber beetles. Cucumber beetles are going to be yellow, and depending on where you are in the country, they might be black and yellow striped or yellow with black or brown spots. And they show up very early in the season, but populations start to build up into midsummer. They're very common in the Midwest and in the Southeast. They affect cucumbers, melons, and squash. And the problem with them is not only will they cause damage in the plant with irregular holes in the leaves and the flowers, they'll chew the seedlings, they can cause damage, but they can also be a vector of bacterial wilt. Bacteria is not something that you can treat for. It's pretty much a death sentence to the plant, and these cucumber beetles are the vector for that. So that makes cucumber beetles especially problematic. But there are some things that you can do to help mitigate their effect on your garden. If you know cucumber beetles are a problem in your area, you might consider planting these crops, starting them indoors, or transplanting them so they are larger seedlings when you plant them into the garden. Because if you start them from seed and you already have a major cucumber beetle presence, they could attack the young seedlings before they're able to get established. I've personally never had to do that. I do have cucumber beetles in my garden, but they've never been terrible. Definitely present, but I've never had this happen. But if it's happened to you, you might consider starting indoors. One thing that I think would be a great idea is to use floating row covers until the plants flower. Or in the case of cucumbers and they're vining, at some point the floating row covers is not going to work very well, but at least use them for as long as you can. Some people use yellow sticky traps outside the beds to be able to attract them. I know that in Susan Mulvihill's book, she has a DIY sticky trap that she shows you how to do. This is something that I've seen a lot of people do, so that might be something to look up. Also, you could select cucurbit varieties, like cucumber varieties, melon varieties that are resistant to bacterial wilt, and they can also be vectors of the cucumber mosaic virus. So if they're resistant to these two diseases, then that can help keep your crop where the disease may not be as much of the problem, and it's more just the chewing and the damage that it does to the plants. You can try planting later to miss the peak feeding of the beetles. This is common for me. Like I said, I do this with squash, but also just planting later in the season also, where toward the end of the season, their populations are going to start to decline. You can add aromatic plants to deter, like marigolds or catnip. You can use thick mulch to prevent them from laying their eggs in the soil. And again, this is an opposite from the squash bugs, where the mulch could cause hiding places for the adults. Well, if you put mulch with cucumbers, then it could prevent them from laying their eggs, which could be helpful. And if you know you have a problem, then removing the plant debris at the end of the season can be helpful. If you have a major infestation, you can handpick, you can vacuum them, you can apply neem oil to the plant, and it does deter feeding a little bit. It's been a long time since I've tried neem oil. I didn't have a huge amount of success, so I haven't done it a whole lot since then, but I do know people that use it, but it might be worth it might be worth trying if you have major issue with cucumber beetles. And then if you know that your cucumber plant or melon or whatever has the virus or the bacterial wilt, then you want to destroy those infected plants. You don't want them to be in your compost pile. You don't want them to stay at all. And as a last resort, you could apply spinosad for extreme infestations. But again, when I've used spinosad, I've not found it to be super effective for beetles. I've had a really hard time finding organic sprays that's effective for beetles altogether. Now, if someone else has had a good experience with something, I am all ears, because we do deal with a lot of beetles. We deal with bean leaf beetles, Japanese beetles, all sorts of beetles that I haven't even mentioned yet. So if you have had success, I would love to hear from you. But so far, I haven't. I've just honestly had to deal with them and be okay with a certain amount of damage. So I hope that this overview has been helpful. And as you hopefully been able to see, each of these pests requires a different approach. Some of them you can plan for early and do some prevention measures. Some of them you have to jump on quickly once they show up. But hopefully you've been able to see that the different types of pests you're dealing with are going to require different types of controls, because what works for one may not work for another. Now, how you approach these pests will also depend on many factors that are individual to you, such as your climate. So you can keep track of when pests show up, and you can adapt the planting times. I've done that with squash vine borer. I know we didn't talk about that on this episode, but that's why I plant a really early planting of squash and a late one, and that's because of squash vine borer. But your population of squash vine borer may appear at a different time than mine. So keep track of when pests show up and try to adjust your planting times if there's a particularly difficult pest. Also, you have to consider the pest pressure. Is it enough to take drastic measures? For example, the cucumber beetle, it seems like we've had a lot the last couple of years, but I haven't seen a huge impact where it was something that I really had to do anything about. So it just depends on how bad the pressure is. Is it really affecting your crop, or is it just a nuisance? And then consider your willingness to do battle. How much work are you willing to do with these pests? Are you willing to go out there every single day and take off all the squash bug eggs and hand dispose all of the adults you see? That could be a lot of work. And it's just a matter of if you want to do it. And you may have a small enough garden and you may have time, and that may be perfectly fine with you. But this is honestly one of the reasons I haven't done a whole lot of that, just because in the past I've had a huge garden and I haven't had the time to be able to stay on top of things like that. But if you're able to, and you have the willingness to do battle with these, especially these more challenging pests, then that will dictate what measures you may want to take. Now, again, in my summer workshop coming up on June 17th, we're going to go even deeper into all of this with organic pest prevention, troubleshooting, including how to identify what the problem is. So let's say you see damage on your plant, but you don't see an insect. How do you know what to do and what might be the problem? We're going to show you a little bit about that. We'll also go over some of the common basic controls that I've talked about briefly here, like neem, BT, diatomaceous earth, what these are, what the risks are, what you use them for, what you don't want to do to protect your garden. We'll talk about all of that. You'll learn what they're effective on, what they're not effective on, how to use them. And then we'll also cover how to keep plants strong and healthy, because one of the best ways to keep your plants resilient against these pests and also against diseases is to create and nurture an environment where your plants are healthy and are able to withstand the damage and the onslaught that comes, whether it's pest, disease, heat, or whatever. So we want to get our plants healthy, and I'm going to show you some ways to do that. I would love to see you there, and to get your ticket with a $10 off coupon using the code SUMMER25, go to journeywithjill.net/summer workshop. And don't forget, the replay is included, whether you're able to come live or you have plans and you can't make it that day. And then we also threw in a bonus preserving workshop for you. If you're interested in preserving, this will be something that you will want to take advantage of. So I hope to see you there on June 17th so we can talk more in depth about all of these things. But I do hope that this episode has been helpful for you to try to give you some ideas how to combat these most common pests that I've seen in my garden, and you've probably seen some in yours too. All right. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you have a great week, and I'll chat with you again in next week's episode.